Thank you, Magda. Hello, everyone, and welcome. It is a great honor to introduce Gurminder Bhambra, Professor of Postcolonial and Decolonial Studies in the Department of International Relations in the School of Global Studies, University of Sussex. She is a Fellow of the British Academy, elected 2020. She has held multiple visiting professorships in places such as the EHESS in Paris, the Department of Sociology, Princeton University, and the Department of Sociology, University of Brasilia. Gurminder's extensive list of publications include the monographs Rethinking Modernity, 2007, Connected Sociologies, 2014, and Colonialism and Modern Social Theory, 2021. Also, with Dalia Gabriel and Kerem Nisansioglu, she co-edited the volume Decolonizing the University, 2018. While Gurminder's research interests are primarily in the area of global historical sociology, she is also interested in the intersection of the social sciences more generally with recent work in post-colonial and decolonial studies. Her current projects are on epistemological justice and reparations and on the political economy of race and colonialism. Today, she will be giving a talk on colonialism and modern social theory. Welcome, Professor Gurminder Bhambra. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and thank you for that introduction. So what I'm going to do today, the talk is called Fictions of Modern Social Theory, and it draws from the book Colonialism and Modern Social Theory that I've written and has just been published, and it was written together with Professor John Homewood. And so what I want to do is give you a sense of why we decided to write this book, some of the key themes that emerge from it, but focus more specifically on what we call the fictions of modern social theory, the fictions that need to be addressed if we're going to develop a more adequate social theory for the future. So I think the key thing that animates the book and has animated my research more generally has really been this sense that discussion of the colonial and imperial past of Europe is missing from modern social theory and the social sciences more generally. But it's not entirely absent. Paradoxically, however, it's become less visible as the social sciences developed. Earlier treatments of the topics in the writings of the classics have rarely been acknowledged in the secondary treatments that come to represent the canon to us. And in colonialism and modern social theory, what we argue for is a reconstruction of social theory and a better understanding of contemporary social thought, its limitations, and its wider possibilities. And so what we do within the book as a whole is examine the role of colonialism and empire in the formation of social theory, looking at the early work of people like Hobbes to Hegel, and then going on to focus more specifically on the work of Tocqueville, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and Du Bois. And what we propose is a post-colonial intervention into the construction of modern social theory that situates its history and its historiography in its colonial context. And so here we provide an account of the key themes motivating the book and set out the 5 fictions that are put in place by the canonical representation of sociology's foundational concepts that we suggest need to be addressed in the reconstruction of modern social theory. So what I'll do first is sort of set out the ways in which contemporary sociology in its Euro-centered mode has typically rested on ideas of the modern world. And it rests on this idea of the modern world emerging out of processes of political and economic revolution, specifically those associated with the 18th century US and French revolutions, and then processes of industrialization within Britain and elsewhere. It's further seen to be underpinned by earlier cultural changes across Europe that were brought about by the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution. Within these understandings, Europe, and here the US is often seen to be coextensive with Europe as one of its settler colonies, but Europe is conflated with modernity, and what that does is render the process of becoming modern, at least in the first instance, one of endogenous European development. At the same time, the rest of the world is regarded as external to these world historical processes, and colonial connections are presented as insignificant to their development. Indeed, they're typically seen to be part of an earlier order that is giving way to modernity and in which they play no part. So in a sense, what's being argued here is that modern social theory really develops in two phases. The first phase is the emergence of a distinctively European voice that's associated with an 18th century Enlightenment, and it involves reflection on religion, politics, and culture. It's understood to be philosophical in orientation and as not yet having developed a full sociological sensibility. The second phase is regarded as a development of the mid to late 19th century, and this culminates in the period of classical sociological theory associated with Weber and Durkheim, with Marx latterly included. And here there's a dominant sociological account of modernity that rests on two fundamental assumptions: rupture and difference. There's seen to be a temporal rupture, that is a rupture in time, that distinguishes a traditional agrarian past from a modern industrial present, together with a fundamental cultural differentiation of Europe from the rest of the world, or in the words of Stuart Hall, of the separation of the West from the rest. These paradigmatic assumptions, as I argued in my first book, Rethinking Modernity, have framed both the standard methodological problems posed by modern social inquiry and the explanations posited in resolving them. And so it's these assumptions that we question within the book. Now, I should just state that whilst accounts of the industrial and French revolutions, and so by implication of modernity itself, have not remained unchanged over time, what has remained constant has been the framing of European origins and subsequent global diffusion within which these events are located. So not only were others not recognized within accounts of the canonical twin revolutions, but the potential contribution of other events and the experiences of non-Western others to the sociological paradigm of modernity has rarely been considered. And I'm happy, so I guess I should just break to say that obviously I'm happy to pick up on any of this in the Q&A and to develop the arguments further. But one thing I would perhaps just like to sort of set out here in a little bit more detail is that the way in which the social sciences are configured, I think, are really done in this way of having a macro narrative of the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution, constituting what it is that brings into being the modern world. And one of the things that I've long argued is that what that does is, A, it doesn't recognize that there were others involved in the events that we locate solely within Europe. So if we think about something like the Industrial Revolution, one of the key motors of industrialization was the development of cotton. Cotton wasn't a plant that's native to Europe, let alone to Britain. It came from India, as did the technology of how to dye and weave it. It was grown in the southern states of the US by Africans who had been taken there as part of the European trade in human beings, and the raw material was brought back to Europe to be turned into cloth. But that cloth could only be sold around the world at the point of a gun because it was of inferior quality to cloth that was being produced in other parts of the world. And so in this sense, the traditional narrative of industrialization is that it's something that happens within Europe, which then disseminates out globally. And I wish to argue that actually it was the global conditions of possibility that enable what we call the Industrial Revolution to actually happen within Europe. So the arguments of diffusion as something that occurs after the amazing stuff that happens in Europe is problematic. It's actually those global connections that enables these developments to occur within Europe. So that's one way of sort of pointing to how others are part of processes that get claimed to be European, but I would argue are actually global. And then there are also other global processes. So whilst the focus is often on the French Revolution and the Declaration of Independence in the US, very few scholars of modernity recognize the Haitian Revolution as a revolution that brings into being the modern world. And yet the Haitian Revolution is the only revolution of its time to make color no bar to political participation and to argue for the full and immediate abolition of enslavement and colonization. And so I would argue that the Haitian Revolution is actually much more radical than either the French or the US, particularly because those actually maintain the colonial world system that's in place at the time. It's only the Haitian that's a challenge to it. So how might we think about modernity differently if we started from Haiti? So just to backtrack then a little bit. So in a sense, I guess what I'm saying there is that these are ways in which I challenge the ways in which sociology and the social sciences more generally come to be framed, and that framing seemed to rest on these particular histories. And I'm arguing for the need to take into account broader histories that would enable us to rethink those sorts of framings. Now, European colonialism emerged from the 15th century onwards, and therefore it precedes Enlightenment and was continuous with the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is the period attributed to European discovery of new worlds, but it involved the appropriation of lands, their settlement, and the development of commercial trade and the resources extracted from them. This early period of colonialism, including the forced labor in mines and on plantations that is entailed, is usually framed as a pre-modern phenomenon, and one that's not essential to the development of modernity. But by framing this as pre-modern, it makes it easier to neglect the fact that European colonialism transformed into imperialism. As such, identifying social theory with the period from 1830 onwards makes it easier to normalize colonialism and to take for granted the overseas possessions of the national European states whose political structures of the rule of law, market exchange, bureaucratic administration, and political representation are proposed as part of the distinctive social and political configuration of modernity, independently of colonialism and imperialism. However, what I'm arguing for here is a need to understand how these processes are integral to modernity and not contingently related to it. Colonialism is not a manifestation of commercial enterprise and the last throes of feudalism, but is actually constitutive of the commercialism that would come to be seen as characteristic of modernity and integral to the development of its associated social and political institutions. In contrast, when empire is addressed, it's not as a phenomenon of European modernity, but of the political organization of earlier social formations. So in this way, I argue for the need to disentangle modern European empires from more general understandings of empire, usually those empires that occurred before European colonial empires. And again, I can talk about that distinction more in the Q&A if you'd like me to do so. And what I would also sort of say is that one of the things that we need to understand is that those states that we understand as nations, primarily the European states, were very rarely nations, states, but were shaped by imperial and colonial entanglements. So having said all this, the issue now is not simply to add colonialism to sociology's repertoire of topics. So whilst I think it's important that we do have a sociology of colonialism, that we understand the variety of colonialisms and so on, I don't want us simply to add colonialism to sociology and then carry on and do things in the same way, but rather to think about how sociology's repertoire has been structured by the absence of its consideration of colonialism, and how, if we were to take colonialism seriously, this would then be fundamentally transformed. So in that way, the argument that we're making in the book is for a renewal of social theory, not an addition to it, and nor its rejection. And central to this renewal would be to recognize and address 5 fictions that we argue currently organize conceptual frameworks across different sociological positions. So these are the fiction of stages of social development, the fiction of modern subjectivity, the fiction of the nation state, the fiction of class and formerly free labor, and finally the fiction of sociological reason. These fictions, and I'll talk about each of them in more detail shortly, what these fictions do is that they're presented as a distillation of the lessons to be learned from an examination of the classical tradition. And so again, just to state, the argument that's being made is not that we shouldn't engage with the work of Tocqueville and Weber and Durkheim and Du Bois and Marx and so on, but rather what we should take issue with is what contemporary sociology has taken to be central from them, and rethink what it is that we can learn from what it is that they have, if you like, set out. So the first of the fictions that we address is the fiction associated with the idea of a state of nature. This was something that is developed in Hobbes and Locke as part of their discussions of the possession and use of resources available in common. The idea of a state of nature appears to establish a common humanity, but it does so in order to justify inequality and differential treatment, because it's a construction which depends upon a distinction between the state of nature and the state of society, where the latter is actually the colonizing society of Europe. So out of this initial construction, there arises a concern to delineate the characteristics of modern society against which other societies can be described and classified. Once stages of society are delineated, it becomes possible to arrange them hierarchically in terms of ideas of development and progress, and to associate particular kinds of social relationship with each type of society. So it's evident that colonialism is directly connected to the emergence of modern society, but within the literature, it comes to be attributed to a late stage of feudal society, which involves encounters with people at earlier stages of development. The taking of other people into possession then is understood not simply as beneficial for those who derive profit from it, but also as a civilizing process for those who are subject to it. And what we argue is that we need to move away from the idea of types of society, which can be understood separately from the relationships among them, and instead look to understand how it's the very connections that structure ideas of difference and domination. The idea of progress and the normative weight attached to it is connected to the second fiction, that of the special nature of modern subjectivity. Modern society is understood to inaugurate a distinctive kind of subjectivity associated with the modern individual and his or her self-determining capacity to act on the basis of reason and self-interest. This is the individual presented as being capable of property and contrasted to those who are either incapable of or indifferent to property. And yet these latter stages, or states rather, are the product of European colonialism and not simply the condition it confronted. In the tradition of modern social theory, for example, modern reason is about the development of autonomy and freedom, and subjecting institutions, including those of religion, to criticism on the basis of reason. This construction is powerful because it also inaugurates the possibility of self-criticism, as it is outlined, for example, in the approach of Frankfurt School critical theory. The very idea of an unfinished project of modernity entails the idea of modernity itself as a project of civilization, where all pre-modern societies are understood as beset by traditional authority and inadequate selves, and not as the basis of knowledge and experiences from which we can also learn. The third fiction is the idea of the nation state. In the development of the idea of the modern individual, two forms of sovereignty are outlined. One is the individual as sovereign, and the other is that of political authority that guarantees the liberty of sovereign individuals. In early modern thought, that political authority is associated with a commonwealth, with no necessary territorial limits, and indeed in justifying the extension of territory. However, the exercise of political authority comes to be associated with nation states, and with European nation states in particular. Weber's formulation has perhaps become the exemplary expression of the position within sociology. Here, the nation state is understood to have a legitimate claim to the monopoly of violence within a given territory, where legitimacy is associated with the state's responsibility for and to its citizens within that territory. Yet, not all members of the population are regarded as citizens or members of what Tocqueville called the society of equals. Further, not all or all European nation states, including their settler offshoots, were actually either empires or participated in the construction of empires through the movement of their populations. And this latter movement consolidated empires and contributed to their societies, in fact, being societies of unequals. In this way, subjects of empire are denied inclusion in the community to whom the patrimony of empire is distributed, and after decolonization, come to be denied citizenship within former colonizing societies. This is the context in which those who share a common political heritage of empire are now represented as immigrants within its metropoles, and as such are presented as threats to the solidarity of the nation and its social contract. I mean, this is in part a debate that's going on quite actively within Europe at the moment. And so it would be interesting also to hear from your local positions how this debate is playing out in different sorts of places. Because one of the things that's happening within Europe is very much an idea that people who come to Europe, that it's problematic because they ought not to be entitled to things like welfare, for example, and that only those who can demonstrate belonging to the nation and therefore can demonstrate a long-standing commitment to the nation and also the paying of tax and so on should now be allowed to draw the benefits that come from that sort of historical longevity. And yet what doesn't get recognized within such claims is that many of the people who come from former empires associated with these nations, and they and their ancestors will have paid in, whether willingly or not, to the wealth that was appropriated at the metropole, which it's now being claimed is only available for those citizens who can demonstrate some degree of legitimacy. And that's something that is associated with this fiction of the nation state. And again, really happy to pick up on this in the Q&A. The fourth fiction that we highlight is that of class and formerly free labor. Now, Marx recognized that modern society was developing as a society of unequals, that is, as a class-divided society. This class division he associated with the system of private property. On the basis of the development of the class relation, proletarian agency would develop to transform private property and create the new society. The class division that Marx described depends upon the centrality of formerly free labor and the commodification of labor power within capitalist modernity. This rule is called into question, however, once we understand the colonial nature of modernity. Commodified labor power does not develop as the central form of capitalism. And moreover, capitalist nation states are able to divide their populations between national citizens and colonial subjects. As Du Bois noted, this provides the possibility of the decommodification of labor power within the metropole by using colonial patrimonies in the provision of welfare and other collective goods nationally that are denied to those in the wider empire. At the same time, colonial subjects are denied the status of free labor and are subordinated within various forms of indenture. In this context, enslavement represents the commodification of the laborer while the abolition of slavery does not give rise to free labor, but to new forms of indenture. Both of these are enduring features of modernity. For example, and again, I use the example of Britain this time, and specifically post-Brexit Britain, where indenture is returning in particular ways in the form of the treatment of migrant labor as not deserving the rights and rewards associated with the citizenship status that's afforded to nationals. So there's beginning to be a separation of people being allowed to enter the country in order to work, but not to have the social rights of citizenship that ought to be available to them at the same time. Coming to the final fiction of sociological reason, I would take a quote from Karen E. Fields, who's a recent translator of Durkheim, and she states, and I quote, "Unreasonable divisions of humankind seem to be born from reason itself, not from its opposite." It's perhaps easy to understand that Enlightenment thought has its darker side, and even to consider sociology as being both within and outside that tradition. However, sociology's task cannot only be to reveal that darker side, but also to consider its own implication in its construction. The dominant forms of sociological method all present sociological reason as ahistorical and as the necessary presupposition for objective inquiry. In this way, sociological reason is made part of the general claim of the Enlightenment, and sociology's difference is simply the extent to which it aligns itself with a critical project that continues it. However, this project is not the self-critical project it claims to be. Understanding sociology as historically formed would place it into conversation with those represented as other and open it to learning. This is not a form of relativism or an argument for multiple perspectives, but it's an argument for a transformation of our own perspective as a consequence of learning from others. And the first step in any process of learning is recognition of a limitation in one's own understanding. So I'll conclude by saying that arguing for a reconstruction of modern social theory is an argument for a transformation in the ways in which we understand the past that constitutes social theory, such that we can imagine new possibilities for the present and the future. To make a future different from our past requires us to better understand how we arrived in the present. It requires us to better understand the limitations of how the generally acknowledged past has been understood by our discipline. Colonialism structures European modernity as well as European thought. And in consequence, recognizing its significance is an opportunity as well as a necessity to practice sociology differently. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for this presentation. I've got a couple of issues I would like you to help me think through. In some of your early work, for example, where you were talking about the connected sociology, sociological projects, etc. My question is, when you look at your intellectual trajectory, how did you move from there to a concern with the issues about the fictions of sociological thought? What is the intellectual imagination that enabled you to move to exactly where you are now?
I mean, so it's interesting to think about that. I haven't necessarily explicitly thought about it. I think, so when I first started, so the very first book, Rethinking Modernity.
Yes.
I was actually doing a completely different project.
Uh-huh.
And in the course of doing that project, one of the things I kept coming across this term, modernity.
Yes.
And I thought, well, I better figure out what modernity is before I move on to doing the other thing that I was going to go on and look at. And one of the things that became very clear to me was that it didn't matter what position a sociologist came from, whether they were Marxists or Barbarians or postmodernists or post-structuralists, etc. And whatever other differences they had, the two things that they all agreed on was that modernity was conceptualized in terms of a temporal rupture, this break in time between a pre-modern past and the modern present, and that temporal rupture was located within a distinct cultural milieu, if you like, which was Europe, and that was significantly different from the rest of the world. Now, my background before that had been in history, and I knew that historians were very skeptical of this idea of radical ruptures and clean breaks and so on. And so I began looking into why it was that sociology was using an understanding of history based on ideas of rupture when most historians contested those ideas of rupture. And so in a sense, the first book, Rethinking Modernity, came out of this wish to challenge the dominant historical understandings that underpin sociology's idea of the past, point to more adequate historical discussions, and see what difference could be made to sociology if we were to take these other histories seriously. So that was the initial work. And from then, one of the things that came to the fore was very much of how colonialism is just, it's like what I said at the very beginning, it's both absent from the social sciences, but it is also there, because the early thinkers couldn't help but talk about colonialism because they were often explicitly involved in colonial projects. So people like Hobbes and Locke were involved in the colonization of what we now call America, and so on. I think Locke was governor and all of Virginia and stuff, and so they couldn't not write about colonialism, even if they called it something else. But then as you develop the way in which people have engaged with these thinkers, the colonial context seems to disappear. And so contemporary commentators on the tradition fail to take seriously the colonial context that was significant at the time that they were writing. And so what we wanted to do in this latest book was to think about, what if we took that colonial context seriously, and if we tried to rethink these thinkers in the context of their time? What did they talk about? How did they talk about it? How is some of this useful? And how might some of this still need to be contested? And it was from there that we came up with this idea of the 5 fictions, because one of the things that we realized is that there are, if you like, things that as social scientists we take as common sense. But this common sense is shaped by the failure to take colonialism seriously, which is why, but they nonetheless have power within our discipline. So we wanted to sort of mitigate that power by calling them a fiction, or point to the ways in which they're constructed, and then think about what it would mean to reconstruct other understandings on the basis of more adequate histories, more adequate understandings of those histories.
Okay, so let me try and push this argument a bit linguistically and ask the following question. Why did you call your book The Fictions of, Fictions, rather than the 5 myths of modern social theory? Why? Because once you start thinking about a fiction, hovering around the idea of a fiction is the notion of a myth. So I'm just interested in your linguistic imagination, why you ended up with the notion of a fiction and avoided the route of talking about a myth? Because the two of them, to some extent, overlap in my own linguistic imagination. So I was just sort of, when you were talking, I was saying to myself, all that you would have talked, if I were writing this, I would have called them myths. So I want to know, from your sociological imagination, what is the intellectual capital that you got from thinking about this as fictions and not myths or other cognate terms?
Yeah. I mean, the book itself is called Colonialism and Modern Social Theory, and it's the last chapter. The conclusion is the fictions of modern social theory. And you just say that. I just realized that in Rethinking Modernity, I use the term myth.
Oh, okay.
And in this book, I use the term fiction. So I think for me, they're probably well, they're certainly cognate terms.
Yes.
I haven't thought about what their differences might be and whether that would be significant.
Okay. Let me ask you another question, then I'll give you over to my colleagues and I'll come back again. As I read one of your books, you kept referring to some of the work by Rowan Cornell, Bonaventura dos Santos, who we have had as our guests here. So I kept asking myself, if you were to engage in a conversation about your work with Rowan Cornell, what would she be saying? Because you're all interested in sort of global sociology and all that. What are the overlaps between your sociological imagination and their sociological imagination? And to use your own term, where are the ruptures between the two of you, where you go your separate ways?
I mean, what would I say? I think we're interested in a common project.
Yes.
Of rethinking the ways in which the discipline has come to be understood. I think, so Raywin's latest work is arguing for Southern theory, arguing for recognition of other thinkers and so on. And Boaventura de Sousa Santos also makes the argument very much of learning from social movements. He himself is involved in the World Social Forum and so on. And I think that these are all important things that we need to engage with. I guess my distinctive contribution would be that I work very much within the tradition. I wish to reconstruct it from the inside.
From within,
according to its own standards. So it says, these are our standards. And I am making the argument that actually you, and here I'm talking about the tradition, that you don't meet your own standards. Because you say that to be rigorous means to do this, but you're not doing this. If we were rigorous, we would need to do this, and that would require us to rethink our very precepts. So I think, so I think they're complementary projects rather than similar projects. They're doing different things, but hopefully with the same aim in mind.
Okay, because then I think if to use your notion of being rigorous, for you, the argument is you're saying you want to be rigorous, but you're not being rigorous. And I can hear Bonaventura Santos saying, okay, you're being rigorous, but there are other ways in which rigor can be met outside in terms of social struggles. Yes, I've got a lot of other questions, but let me give over to Raphael, then other people can come in and I can jump in later on. Raphael.
Thank you.
Thanks, it was a very nice conversation.
Great, thanks for initiating the discussion, Makoni. And Magda has a question.
Yes, Dr. Bhambra, I didn't know that you would be mentioning Bonaventura de Sousa Santos, and my question is related to your myth of nation state and also to his work, and what is your take on that? So one of the myths you mentioned in the modern social theory is the nation state. And Bonaventura de Sousa Santos, in 2008, he had an important conference in Bolivia, and then in 2009 there was this book that for me is very eye-opening. I only know the title in Spanish, and I read it in Spanish. It's called Pensar el Estado y la Sociedad, which would be thinking the state and the society. And being kind of making this locus of enunciation from the Latin America, he was problematizing how modern state is not reflecting the actual political practices of people, which are plurinationalistic, right? Because there are various nationalities coexisting in what would be one territory, one nation. So he was questioning those nation states based on a specific, as he called, constitutionalism. So he is mentioning those 3 types of constitutionalisms. And the last one, which would be like this post-colonial type in which different nationalities can express their interculturality. And it's like I think he called it kind of like a free contract to live together. So I just wanted to ask you, like, this new constitutionalism in the political theory that Bonaventura de Soutos mentions, which is post-colonial, which is very much against the modern nation state. How is this model related maybe to the vision that you have of renewing the social theory?
I mean, I think it links in because in a way, what we're presenting is this idea that the nation state is a fiction. And why I'm saying it's fiction is not in terms of the state itself being a fiction, but the genealogy that we give to that state is fictional. So within standard social science, there's a sense that the nation state draws its history from the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, the construction of ideas of what it is to be a nation. That develops through the French Revolution up until the times, then becomes a modern nation and so on. And yet, if we look at European states during that period, very few of them focus their attention only on activities internal to the boundaries that would constitute them as a nation. The majority of them were, in fact, empires. They exercised their power beyond the territorial national boundaries over populations and over territories that were more extensive. And so in that sense, and yet modern social science organizes itself in terms of an idea of the nation and an idea of the nation that has existed historically. So if we think about what it is to be a national citizen, it's somebody who can demonstrate belonging to the history of the nation over time. But if these entities were not nations, but empires, then those who can demonstrate belonging to that broader polity is a much more expansive population. And so it distorts contemporary social science to work with the idea that our history is a history that can be organized by the nation state. So in that sense, there's possibly a mismatch in the way in which because you're talking about an empirical nation state and how do we understand an empirical state that's plurinational rather than ethno-national. And I'm making the argument that no state within Europe lives up to the definition of being a nation state because none of them were nation states. They were all empires. But to call them nation states distorts what it's possible to say in the present when the present is organized in those ways.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see that Bassi wrote a set of questions in the chat box about terminology in sociology, and Saliko Komofone has raised his hand. So I will first ask the set of questions on behalf of Bassi, and then pass on the word to Saliko. So Bassi asks, should a term such as modernity have or be given universal currency? How are subjects of the empire, their practices, context, excluded from what is apparently Eurocentric terminology? Is there inadvertent complicity taking place in the use of terminology? Should we be rethinking the term modernity? If, as you say, and you obviously agree with Mignolo, there is a dark side of European modernity, why should subalterns be using this term? Should we be making a case for multiple alternative modernities in sociology?
Okay, so I have written on this quite extensively in the sense that I think the shift to multiple or alternative modernities actually replicates all the problems of modernity, because the way in which modernity itself is conceptualized, it is presented, you're right, as a universal concept. And it's presented as a universal concept that draws its history from Europe, with the presentation that that history also has universal implications. So it's a European history that is the basis for the development of a concept, which then gets called universal. When people have critiqued this idea that the history of Europe is providing the basis for the construction of a universal concept, what people who are committed to that framework say is, well, we've got this concept, you go off and develop your own concept. So you now have an Islamic modernity, an African modernity, an Indian modernity, a Chinese modernity. You have multiple modernities, but all those multiple modernities exist in a relation of inferiority to the concept of modernity. So that's presented always as universal, even though you could argue that that in itself is parochial because it draws on European history, not on other histories. And also its understanding of European history is further inadequate because what is claimed as European history is not just European. As I was explaining with the Industrial Revolution and so on, these histories are already global. So it's the claiming of a global history as a European history and then calling that specific European history universal, which is the trick that Weberians in particular do to establish the idea of an ideal type for which there can be no reconstruction. All you can have is an additive response. But the additive response through multiple or alternative modernities does nothing to challenge the inadequacy of the concept of modernity itself. So I'm not arguing for a different word. I'm arguing for us to acknowledge that what we understand as modernity is, in the work of people like Quijano and others, colonial modernity. That there isn't any colonialism separate to modernity, and there is no modernity separate to colonialism. We have misunderstood modernity to the extent that we don't recognize the colonial constitution of modernity. So it's arguing for the need to transform our thinking of what modernity is. And it is colonialism.
Salikoko, you can ask your question or make your comment.
Yes, thank you for a thought-provoking lecture. I wonder whether characterizing nation states as a fiction really serves your purpose adequately. Because after all, in the colonial empires, there's a distinction between the metropole and the colonies. Mm-hmm. And the metropole controls what's going on in the empire. And so for the people that hold power, that set the rules and control everybody else, the nation state is not fiction. Moreover, the citizens of the nation states have different rights from members of the empire. And it's not quite clear to me whether the empires include the nation states themselves. You know, we wind up with these revolutions, such as the American Revolution, such as the Haitian revolutions, which are risings against the control of the metropole. So when you characterize the nation state as fiction, aren't you just looking at one side of the story and overlooking the other?
I agree, but the point I would perhaps want to stress is that it's the nation state as fiction, because I'm not disagreeing that there was a national project at the heart of empire, that organized relations between the metropole and the colonies, usually in terms of racial hierarchy. And that was organized in the language of the nation. But the polity was not a nation state. It was a national project in an imperial state. And the reason I wish to insist on that is because otherwise the way in which we think about it is that we think that the nation has a colony. So if we're thinking about Britain, you have an entity called Britain and it has a colony, and that it's possible to understand these things separately. And that's the way in which most histories have developed. You have a history of Britain and you have a history of the British Empire. And these two things are quite separate. And I want to make the argument that actually the state was a British imperial state. It had consequences for all those who were within it. And those consequences were organized across an understanding of racial hierarchy that was organized in terms of a national project at the heart and the rest. And that would enable us to understand the connections and the way in which Westminster, for example, organized processes of extraction, which drew resources from the empire into its heart, and then only distributed them through welfare within the nation. And if we don't acknowledge that the British imperial state was an imperial state, it's imagined, and it certainly is in terms of British social scientists who work on welfare, they think that the money available to Westminster came only through the taxes of the people within Britain. And that's just not true. Half of the money that was available to the government in Westminster came from empire. So if we don't insist on that broader frame, then we allow people to imagine that the wealth of European states is a consequence of what Europeans did in Europe, and not a consequence of the colonial drain, as people like Dadabai Naroji, Utsa Patnaik and others have argued. That colonial drain, which came from all of empire, made those other places poor and made European states rich at that consequence. We naturalize that inequality if we don't insist on the commonality of the space. And so that's why I wish to make that argument.
My reaction to your answer to my question, I think legitimates the question that I asked you, in the sense that the rest of the empire wouldn't have felt exploited and wouldn't have asked for independence in the case of exploitation colonies, or wouldn't have engaged in revolutions in the case of the United States, for instance, and Haiti, because we are dealing with two overlapping colonial entities. Excuse me, I have to decline it. We are dealing with overlapping political entities here. And one of them is benefiting from the larger aggregation of territories that it is exploiting. And so even if you characterize the colonial enterprise as a project, or the nation state as a project, is a project fiction, or is a project an undertaking?
So I'm talking about the nation state as a conceptual category within the social sciences being a fiction that isn't associated with a reality. So European states were not nation states, because if they were nation states, they would have generated their income, their wealth, etc., through the activities of their national citizens. That is not true. What we think of as nation states generated their income, generated their wealth through their imperial activities, not through what it is. So nation states only come into being after decolonization. It's the fight against empire that actually produces nation states, and produces nation states of European countries. So European countries were not nations until decolonization. Because how can you be both a nation state and an empire? To me, that's part of the problem of our failure to recognize the connections that produce the world we're in. And just as another point, I mean, you sort of said it twice now about the US Revolution. The US, I do not think that it's possible to think about the American Revolution in the same space as the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution was a revolution against colonization and against enslavement. The American Revolution was a revolution that produces enslavement and produces further colonization of indigenous peoples. What we call the American Revolution is better understood as a British Civil War, because it was British people in America fighting against the authority of British people in Britain. It was not a native population fighting against a colonial oppressor. In fact, the Brits in America went on to colonize the rest of that territory, subjugate, eliminate the native peoples, and establish plantations and perpetuate slave society and segregated society through until the middle of the 20th century. Segregation was acceptable there. So I really think we need to rethink the American Revolution. It's not a revolution equivalent to colonial revolutions.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's somebody else.
Yes, I said that Oyeronke has a question.
Yes, I do.
Hmm.
Well, thank you so much for that very enlightening discussion of modernity and drawing attention to the concept colonial modernity is actually a tautology. I agree with you on that. And I agree also with you about the myth of the nation state as a project. However, in some of your responses about the fiction of the nation state, you cast your eyes rightfully towards the empire and the imperial part of the state, the European state. But you seem to forget that no European nation state was ethno-national either. It is not only because of their colonies that they were problematic, but they were pretending to be nations and homogeneous. And that has caused a lot of strife and violence in the ways in which post-colonial African states are supposedly modeling themselves on their colonial masters. I want to use that master deliberately because they are still treating them as the role model. So I think it's also important to pay attention to what is going on inside the so-called nation states. I think with the US, it's easy to see because citizens are unequal, the racialization and all that. But the same thing in France. And since our hosts are linguists, I think that one of the ways in which this plays out wonderfully is the way in which they impose one language as the lingua franca, whether it was in France or even whether it was in the UK. So I thought that it's important to draw that out, especially for us Africans. Basil Davidson has a wonderful book, Africa and the Burden of the Nation State, and the ways in which that burdens Africa. That's my first comment and question, but I have other questions. I'm looking forward to reading your book, and I think that the stance you take, I'm a sociologist too, but I don't normally want to claim to be a sociologist because despite my almost 40 years in the United States, and I have been in a sociology department for 20 years, I'm totally on the periphery of it. And the reason why I'm on the periphery is precisely that whole question of nation state and what nations and societies and what sociologists study. I insist on working on Africa, and my working category has been Yoruba, which is one of Nigeria's major nations, but because we didn't create the nation state, we were divided up. So Yoruba became quote and unquote tribal, even if there are 50 million of us in Nigeria and what have you. So one of my colleagues told me once, well, you know, it's difficult to treat you as a sociologist because sociologists deal with national societies and you don't. Okay? So you have talked about, in your talk, you talked about the fact that we shouldn't, we should focus on we shouldn't rank societies. We should not focus on difference, but how societies relate to each other. And I agree with that. However, I want you to elaborate further how we can do away with difference, or why we must do away with difference. Because I keep running up against this idea when I say that in Yoruba epistemology or in Zulu epistemology, they organize the family differently. People say, oh, you want to fetishize difference. What are we supposed to say or do in order to articulate our own realities beyond the colonial? One final small question. Of course, one of the fictions of imperialism and modernity is that Europeans were distributing the fruits of modernity to the rest of the world. And I always tell my students, is slavery a fruit of modernity? Is genocide the fruit of modernity? But seriously, in your work, how did you articulate specifically how the pillage and plunder and the wealth that was generated in the colonies informed, for example, the French Revolution and the life in the so-called metropole? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for those questions. I mean, I think in terms of your first question in relation to the nation and the way in which what is seen to be the nation in Europe, which is held up as the paradigmatic version against which everybody else is judged, is precisely what I'm trying to critique by pointing to the fact, A, that these were not nations, and pointing also strongly to the fact that nation states only come into being after decolonization. And the entity that comes into being after decolonization and organizes itself as a nation state then gets judged in terms of whether it meets the criteria that we've established on the basis of looking at European national forms. And yet they will always be deficient because European nations were empires. So if you're judging the success of a contemporary nation state against what we call a European nation state, but that nation state was actually an empire, then contemporary post-colonial states will always be deficient because they're not empires in the way, I mean, some of them might be now trying to be, but they're not empires in the way in which European states were empires. So I absolutely agree with you. And also, you know, that idea that they were ethno-national or had a common language. They forget the way in which Italy and Germany were established on the basis of many dialects, many, including different religions and all sorts. And, you know, so they point to the artificiality of contemporary nations according to the naturalness of old European nations. And yet there's nothing that distinguishes them. So I agree completely. On the issue of difference, I think, what are we supposed to say? Well, difference is there for me to be learned from. And what would it mean to think about difference without hierarchy? So I don't have a problem with difference. What I have a problem with is that within the European schema, difference always seems to have to be hierarchized. So things are better or worse, not that they might be different and that there might be things to learn across differences. So I think that's perhaps one way to address this. And on the last case, in relation to thinking about that pillage, I mean, an article that I've been working on that will hopefully be out in the next couple of months is looking explicitly at the fact that within Britain, and I've also looked at other European empires, and I'm happy to sort of talk about those as well, but I'm based in Britain. This is where the work that I do is sort of organized. That if we think about welfare, and the welfare state is seen to be established on the basis of taxation paid by citizens over time, the working class within Britain didn't pay income tax until the First World War. So 1916 is around the time that they began to pay. And the British middle class as well didn't really pay any income tax until the First World War. When Britain took over control of India, explicitly after the East India Company, it takes it over after the Indian Mutiny, 1857, and then establishes direct rule. It establishes an income tax in India in 1860. And so there is a level, and obviously if you earn under that level, you don't have to pay, but otherwise everybody has to pay income tax. That tax comes directly to Westminster. It's not a tax that's used to administer empire in India. It's a tax that comes to Westminster. And even though India is poorer than Britain, because there's so many more people, the amount of money that comes to be extracted from India is sufficient to enable the working class within Britain not to have to pay tax. And so the British government manages any domestic revolts by not having any taxation of its local population, but taxing its colonial population. And that taxation is also part of what contributes to the massive famines that occur in India. So during the period of the income tax being established in 1860 until about the 1920s, estimates vary, but between around 40 million people die of starvation caused by famines produced by British colonial rule. And when arguments are made about the fact that the tax that Indians pay, some of it ought to be used to mitigate the extreme effects of famine, the argument in Britain is, well, if we accept this argument, then we might have to pay for the Indian poor at other times as well. So we're not going to accept that argument. We're not going to provide relief for famine. So in this argument where taxation is supposed to produce a reciprocity, that is, you pay tax and you get something in return, that reciprocity is only organized in terms of the national organization, but the extraction is occurring at imperial level. And what Britain does with India, it also does with many of its other imperial holdings. And after Indian independence, when Britain becomes more explicit in its colonization of its African colonies, it organizes that same drain, this time through the fact that particularly places like Nigeria, Ghana, but also Malaysia are able to sell their raw products for dollars, and it organizes a dollar pool. So all the money that these countries are earning through their exports, Britain accumulates in Westminster and doesn't allow those countries access to. So the inequalities that then develop over that period are inequalities that are not natural. They're explicitly produced. Britain is able to develop its welfare state because it has access to the wealth and resources of its empire. And that's also the reason why other countries aren't able to develop welfare states. It's nothing to do with any sort of deficiency politically or socially. it's to do with pure economic extraction. And if we don't acknowledge that history, we could fall into the trap of thinking that development is what is needed. Instead, what I would argue for is reparations.
The French case is even extreme and very contemporary, because our French colonies in West Africa continue to pay France compensation for colonizing them. One final question. This is important to me and maybe other people. One of the things that incense me these days, even as we talk about the pandemic and vaccine inequality and all, in our discourse of the global system, we talk about rich and poor nations. And I hate those categories precisely because they normalize the exploitation over the years, as if being rich was inherent and being poor. So I have been thinking, and I think that you have gone further than I have, in trying to come up with new terms that we can put in people's mouths. I don't want to hear the poor nations have no vaccine, the rich nations have vaccines. And it's like, how dare you? We know why you have this. So please help us to come up with language, okay? Even if you can't do it now.
I mean,
we need to change that language, because every time we say that, we normalize all those fictions and more.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, absolutely. And I, so just on that point, there are at least 7 West African countries whose entire gold reserves are held in Paris, and they're not allowed access to them, except that France agrees to that access and has put conditions on it. So this idea that formal decolonization may have involved some degree of political decolonization, but there has not been economic decolonization relatedly. And I think that we do need to change the terminology. So one of the things that, I mean, particularly within the area of sort of the discipline of development, for example, I refuse to use that language. I refuse to use the language of the developed world and the developing world, for example. And I think it has to be organized in terms of, the world that colonized and the world that was colonized. And think about it, that the poverty in particular places is a consequence of 200 years of colonization. And the wealth in some places is a consequence of 200 to 500 years of colonization for them as well. And so we need to shift that language, absolutely. Stop the naturalization of the inequalities and point to what has produced this inequality.
Thank you. 2 more people would like to make interventions. There is Sangeeta Bhagagupta and then Desmond Odugo.
Thank you for a very thought-provoking talk and discussion so far. This has been really interesting. I think one of the points you make sort of has got me thinking that this is not just something needed within sociology. You very eloquently point out, I think you said you, and then the you was to the tradition that is not meeting its own standards and its own traditions. And okay, so I have a very strong multidisciplinary background, so I don't have a tradition. But if you look at the canvas, there are a number of traditions that need to be interrogated on its own terms. So what this does is that instead of the universalizing discourse that has been critiqued, for instance, in Southern theory, and the call for pluriversal or multiversal, you are, as far as I understand, allowing for thinking from within the canvas. So not creating more canvases. So, okay, so I'm probably not very articulate there. I do have a question. And I think you have been asking whether people are interested in discussing empire. Are empires to be understood in the singular? are there not differences between, for instance, Western and Eastern European historical trajectories? And this is an issue that is being made in different ways against the concept of Eurocentrism. So can you comment on that and also illuminate that from the kinds of work that you're involved in?
Thank you for that. Yes, I do make a distinction between empires, and I think that there is something very different between European empires of exploitation and domination and other empires that have existed within world history. And so to give one example, so for, and partly because I'm not a historian, I don't know the full details, but I've read enough to be able to sort of begin to sift between these understandings, but I'm really happy to hear more from people to help me sort of refine these distinctions further. European empires established themselves, or no, how to put it this way, that if we think back historically before modern European empires, one of the ways in which imperial forms came to be constructed was through the gradual sort of taking in of more and more territory and more populations. And those territories and populations would often be ruled within a common framework. So there may well have been hierarchies between the populations and territories that were being ruled, but they were seen to be subject to the same order of rule. When European empires began to establish colonies, and these were often at a distance, the populations that were colonized were not regarded as being subject to the order of rule of national populations. A distinction was made between colonial populations and national populations, such that national populations, participated in political representation increasingly. Obviously, there were distinctions of class and gender within those, but there was still a sense that they were part of a particular population as distinct from other populations who had absolutely no rights in relation to the metropole. And beyond that, the empire was built on the extraction of resources from one part for the service only of another part. And that, for me, marks a clear distinction between European empires and other empires. And to give one sort of example of this is if we think about the Mughal Empire within India, and we think about within the areas of Bengal and so on, where when you had Mughal rule, you also had taxation. So the people within the Mughal Empire would pay a tax. Some of that tax would be put to one side, such that when you had adverse weather conditions or something approaching a famine, that money would be used to alleviate what was coming as a famine. And you didn't have famines that produced death under Mughal rule. Once taxation was taken over by the East India Company and then by the British state, none of the money that was collected in taxation was used for the benefit of the population from whom it was collected. That taxation went entirely to Britain and was used for British interests, such that when you had adverse weather conditions, when you had a situation that was approaching a famine, the East India Company and Britain preferred to let people die in massive numbers than use any of the taxation to alleviate the famine. So under British colonial rule, you had extensive mass death from famine. You didn't have that under the Mughal Empire, and you haven't had that since the end of British colonial rule. So there's something about European empires that enable that, that facilitate that, that are built on that. And that marks them out, in my mind, as distinct from other forms of empire.
Thank you for that. But if it's okay, I have two questions based on what you just said. One is that, what about Eastern European empires? Were they, do you see a differentiation between the very telling example that you present with the Mughal Empire now. And the second thing, you say you're not a historian. So what about divisions between within sociology? When you are talking from within, aren't we seeing these divisions that allow for a multidisciplinary discussion platform? So can you talk to both these?
So I think within Eastern Europe, I mean, are you sort of thinking of like the Austro-Hungarian Empire? And
Yeah.
so, but I think those are, if you like, contiguous empires. They're empires that incorporate the populations within a common framework, and the populations are all subject to the same order of rule. There may be hierarchies and differences within there, but there's the possibility for those populations to be regarded as part of that entity. Within the British Empire, colonial subjects were not regarded as part of the entity. They were to be extracted from, but nothing was due to them as a consequence. So I think that's one difference also with, for example, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and so on. The social sciences, I think, have to take history seriously. And it's the histories that we have, because the social sciences emerge and develop their concepts on an understanding of what the past has been. And if that past is understood only in terms of modernity, where modernity is the unique endeavors of Europeans, that's been the basis for the development of sociological and social scientific concepts. If instead of regarding modernity as something uniquely European, we regarded modernity as coloniality, then that would have to shift the ways in which we understand. And so in that way, I'm arguing for a deeply historical social science, or I'm saying that you can't have good social science without a proper engagement with history. And so in that sense, we need to speak across these, but also think about how that history gets mobilized within our disciplines in order to effect a transformation of those disciplines.
Thank you for that. We're reaching the end of this first moderated session, but we do have time for someone else to join in the conversation before we move on to the after party. So Desmond, please.
Thank you, Raphael, and thanks everyone, and particularly Dr. Bhambra for these very insightful comments. I should preface my sort of question with a note, and that is that I agree with much of your arguments. And in my little way, I've been engaged in these thoughts and try to share them with my own students and in little ways in my own writing. So it's very helpful to hear echoes of those thoughts, a lot better articulated than I could have ever imagined. So as I listen to you and try to engage with the implications of what you're dealing with here, I want to understand your project as an argument against a madman. And I say madman intentionally, not madwoman, because I think colonial modernity has been a very masculine project. Now, if this is the case, and if I think the key agenda here is epistemic in nature, that is to help sociology, and I agree with Sangeeta here that this is not just sociology, but the entire corpus of academic scholarship in the Western tradition. If the goal here is to help it rethink itself, rethink social theory, I wonder if the politics of that agenda, the politics of that project, is that once we can get our minds right, once we can get to begin to think about these issues right, then the politics will sort itself out, it will begin to act differently. But when I think of the impact of Europeans on human history and think of it as an engagement with a madman, I struggle with that assumption. That is, I struggle to think that You can solve this problem purely at the intellectual level and then reap the harvest at the social or political levels. Whether this madman will not turn the same project of rethinking social theory itself into another colonizing tool. In the ways that I've tried to engage with this, I constantly see every attempt to critique not just modernity, but our own intellectual engagement with that modernity as another tool for colonial modernity to appropriate that dissent and try to turn it into reproducing the politics. Because it seems like that politics of hierarchy, the politics of extraction and exploitation is the stable thing. We can rethink the way we talk about it so long as we don't disrupt the actual relationships. So I wonder how you might engage with that politics, the political impact. How do we engage with changing the real conditions so that you don't have famine killing people, or you don't have people not just called poor, but living lives they don't choose for themselves as a result of someone else's thinking. But thank you for all of this.
No, thank you so much for that. I mean, that's a really important caution and a really important sort of intervention, because in a sense, the work that we do within the academy, as an academic, I can only hope to persuade. And persuasion here will hopefully do something, but it won't do anything if there isn't more going on outside the academy. So the world will only change as a consequence of what happens outside the university. But what we can do within the university is hopefully also provide the space for the deliberation of ideas, for the understanding. And I can't not believe that if we didn't understand our history better, we wouldn't act differently. I have to hold on to that hope, because otherwise, who are we as humans? If we can't hold on to the hope that we can learn, then what are we saying? I mean, we just end up in a sort of, a Gambin or whatever, fighting through the power of our will and so on. Maybe that is what the world is. But I want to hold on to the hope that we can learn, and that learning would make a difference.
I appreciate that. And I hope to continue to seek my path to that hope as well, because I think there is not very much left in our history to think otherwise. Thank you, really.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Magda, Basis, Salikoko, Oyeronke, Sangita, and Desmond for asking the questions and leading the discussions, and everyone else for following the discussions, and in particular, Gurminder Bhambra for engaging with the questions in such interesting and eloquent way. Makone, would you like to have some final thoughts before we move on to the after party? Yes.
I just want to build on to what Desmond was saying, what Sangita and company was saying, and say that because of the current state of the academy and disciplines, etc., we cannot avoid hoping that there is a better way of doing what we are doing. If you lose that capacity to hope for a better way of reconfiguring the disciplines, I don't know what you're left with, right? And so the issue for me is not so much how much the change will be, but it's a commitment to some future where these academic disciplines are practiced differently, that there must be a way in which these arrangements can be rethought. Because if I lose that ability to hope, then it means that I don't have a sense of history. So if there's anything that I've learned from the notions of history, is that change of some sort is possible. I might not be able to accomplish all that I want in my own academic career, but I just hope that it is indeed possible to think differently and to think in a much more radical way which makes another generation of scholars do their work in a better and less traumatized way than I do my own. So for me, the future is there for the grabbing. The empires have done their work, but my freedom is largely one which I seek to accomplish as I move on into the future. For example, this project that we are on together, I mean, we are fully booked until 2023. Nobody would have thought about this when we started, when we were only 2 or 3 with 1 or 2 people. So there is really, to some extent, some hope that some change is indeed possible. It might not be big, but some change is indeed possible. Because without believing that some change is possible, who are you in actual fact? You're left with nothing, right? Except frustration. So I better be more of an optimist I prefer to be an optimist than a realist. Because it is through optimism that change comes. Realism consolidates the present. That's all that I wanted to say before we move on to the after party.
Yes, thank you. Gurminder, would you like to share some final thoughts?
Oh, it's been a really, really wonderful conversation. So thank you so much for the questions and the engagement with what I've been saying and pushing me to think about these things in even more depth and more broadly and stuff as well. So thank you so much for that.
Okay, let me ask you one question. I was rereading your book and you talk about the impact, let's say, of Latin American decolonial thought on the sociology and other decolonial thinking. And I kept wondering, but what is the impact of decolonial thinking outside Latin America on Latin America itself? The other way around. What has been the impact of the work in decolonial thought, let's say by you, other people like Nicola Kakov, Julia, etc., outside Latin America, on Latin American thought itself, the other way, if we were to turn the world upside down? Because they must be impacted also by what is being done outside, because they're not above the planet, hopefully not.
No, I mean, I think that would be an interesting question to explore. I'm not sure I'm best placed to answer that. I think, you know, because in a way, one of the few times when I did I visited Brasilia and I did a couple of talks at the university there and so on. And one of the things that came clear was similar to some arguments that get made in North America. There wasn't really an understanding of people within Latin America that they themselves are colonizers. So they see themselves in a subordinate role to, say, North America or to Europe, but don't recognize that to the extent that they are of European descent, that they themselves are settler colonists on land where there are indigenous people, and again, where Africans were brought. And the representation of many of these countries is as white and blonde. And yet, if you look at the demographics of their populations, they're much darker and they're indigenous. And how does one engage with those histories in a way that I don't think decolonial thought has explicitly dealt with either? So I think the work of people like Quijano, Maria Lugones and others is really, really interesting. But then you also have the work of people like Silvia Kusakanki, who's making the argument much more of the need to understand European descended South Americans as being involved in the exploitation and elimination of indigenous peoples, and how that also has to be taken into account. So there's the need for many, many more conversations, I think.
Yeah, I see what you mean. That there's need to look into this at a multi-layered levels to see what is taking place. Okay. Then the last question I had here was, I was thinking about within sociology, about sociological methodologies, etc. How do they work now? if, for example, your argument is that sociology is not as rigorous, they're not meeting their own criteria. Methodologically, if you're advising a PhD student in terms of issues about method, what would you tell them? One, would you think it is necessary to have a method? And if so, what would you advise them? How would you advise them?
I mean, I think there the questions are, well, it depends what they're doing. So my entry into sociology is really as a historical sociologist. And so then there's that side of things. But if students are doing qualitative or quantitative research, I'm not somebody who believes that one needs to decolonize methodologies. I think one needs to, as I was saying with other stuff, think about whether those methodologies are being used appropriately. Are they meeting the standards that you would wish them to meet? That when you do qualitative research, are you being considerate to the populations who are being researched? What is the possibility for them to feed back into what it is that you're doing? So I would have it be a conversation around the adequacy of the methods being used in relation to what it is that the student wishes to find out, and to have the question in a way almost much more pragmatic in that sense.
Okay, good. Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, Raphael, do you want to wrap up? Or?
Well, I think now I've just we're 10 minutes past the official time, so we can move on to the after party. I think will Kim have information on future events? Yes.